Welcome. Congratulations.
I would now request Aditi Banerjee to please come and deliver her talk on the book, The Curse of Gandhari.
Well, that is certainly a very difficult talk to follow, but I shall do my best. So The Curse of Gandhari is actually a novel I wrote based on the personality of Gandhari in the Mahabharata. So what I thought I would do is start by retelling what the Mahabharata, the critical edition of the Mahabharata, actually tells us about Gandhari. And she's actually quite an enigmatic, mysterious figure in the Mahabharata. There is not as much written about her as, say, Draupadi or Kunti. What the Mahabharata tells us is that Gandhari was a princess from the kingdom of Gandhara, which can be found in modern northwest Pakistan. She was the princess, she was the daughter to the king Subala. She had 100 brothers. Among them was Shakuni, who of course becomes a very important person in the story of the Mahabharata. And it is said that she had obtained a boon from Shiva himself that she would bear 100 sons. And Bhishma is aware of this boon, and he actually requests the hand of Gandhari to be married to Dhritarashtra, the blind prince. And it is also said that when Gandhari learns that she's to be married to Dhritarashtra, she blindfolds herself, and so she will never be able to see what her husband cannot see. And the other thing that the Mahabharata tells us is that from that moment, she never thought of another man beside her husband. Besides that, it doesn't tell her what was going through her head at the time that she blindfolded herself. Then it is said she went to Hastinapur. Shakuni and others accompanied her. They left her there, and then Shakuni and the others went back. There isn't a whole lot said between then and the next famous incident that happens in Gandhari's life, which is that now there are the two, there's Kunti and there's Gandhari, Kunti the wife of Pandu and Gandhari the wife of Dhritarashtra. And Gandhari is actually the first between the two of them to conceive. So she's the first to become pregnant. But her pregnancy lasts for over 2 years. And one day she learns that Kunti has actually given birth before her. So Yudhishthir is born before her Gandhari's first son is born. And what the Mahabharata says is that when Gandhari learns this, she is so overcome by feeling that she strikes her belly very hard, repeatedly. And she strikes her belly so hard that this mass of flesh comes out of her. It's this mass of flesh that then Vedavyasa comes and divides into 101 parts, her 100 sons and one daughter. And it takes about another year or so for those to grow into her babies. And the other thing that we are told in the Mahabharata is that in the meantime, Dhritarashtra has fathered another son through a maid, Yuyutsu, who's born after Dhritarashtra but is born around the same time. The other famous incident or major incident that happens is when Krishna comes to Hastinapur. The war is about to start. Of course, during the disrobing of Draupadi, the Mahabharata doesn't say much about Gandhari's reactions. I mean, the women were not really in the assembly hall at that time. So the next prominent part where Gandhari comes is when Krishna comes to Hastinapur in one last attempt at diplomacy to stop the war from happening. And no one is able to get through to Duryodhan. So Gandhari is actually called to court to speak to her son and to try to stop him from going to war. So she gives a very long speech at that time, which is very eloquent and it's very moving. And she tells Duryodhan that victory will go where dharma is, that this war that he wants to fight, he cannot possibly win, and that he should conquer his inner self and not worry about the kingdoms, that no lasting peace will come through fame or rich or conquering kingdoms. But he does not listen, and of course the war begins. The other famous story that we remember Gandhari for is that she calls Duryodhan to appear before her naked, so that for one moment she can remove her blindfold and look upon him and make him immortal with her gaze. That's not in the critical edition of the Mahabharata, but it's a very important part of the tradition that we have. And what is said is, so we know that she had so much power that with her gaze she could make him immortal. And we also know that it doesn't work, because when Duryodhan actually comes before her, he has a piece of cloth tied around his waist, because Sri Krishna had seen him and said, "You cannot appear before your mother like this." And when Gandhari sees this, she doesn't say, "Take off that cloth and let me protect all of you." She knows that the cause is lost, and that Duryodhan will be lost as well. So her tapobala goes in that moment. Then once the war is over and her sons have all been defeated and killed, Yudhishthir comes before her, and again she is so overcome that she sees just through the corner of her eye beneath her blindfold just the little edge of his feet, and his toenails immediately blacken, and he jumps back in fear. So that's the strength and depth of her feeling at that moment. And we are also told that she has this divine vision where she can see everything that on the battlefield. She sees all of the corpses, and the Mahabharata goes on at some length about how devastating this vision is. Corpses are mutilated and broken in half so that you cannot match the head with the body that it came from. And before she actually curses Krishna, she spends long passages just describing all those who have been lost, soldiers from both sides who've been lost, the women who've been widowed, the mothers who've lost their sons. She goes on and on recounting them. And she basically says, "We are helpless, but you, Krishna, for whom nothing is impossible, you could have prevented the war from happening." And she lays the responsibility of the war on him. And she says in a very curious curse that in 36 years, just as these families have all been destroyed, your clan will also be destroyed, will destroy themselves. And when Krishna hears this curse, he accepts it with half a smile. And then in the next breath, he says, "I accept that, but you yourself should realize, don't forget what you said when you told Duryodhan that victory would go where dharma is. And what was your part in all of this? Don't turn a blind eye to the faults of your own sons." So he is quite stern with her in that moment. Beyond that, we do not know much about what happens to Gandhari, other than 12 years after the war has ended, Dhritarashtra decides to retire to the forest. He cannot deal with the taunts of Bhim anymore, so he wants to retire to the forest. Gandhari accompanies him, as does Kunti, to look after them, and Sanjaya also goes with them. And we are told that after a few years, they die in a forest fire, and it's a little bit it's left a bit enigmatic. So the question I most often asked is, why write about Gandhari? She's clearly not a conventional heroine in the sense that Kunti or Draupadi is. There's a lot in her that is ambiguous. There's a lot about her that we do not know. But I think the very fact that she's so complex and nuanced is what made her very fascinating for me. So a few aspects of that. To begin with, there's the blindfolding itself. And most often when Gandhari is discussed, it's always just as a symbol of her blindfold. So there are a few different interpretations. One is that it was the act of a devoted, loyal wife, Pativrata, and it's just left at that she was a very ideal wife. The other more modern interpretation is that, well, she couldn't control what her circumstances would be. She couldn't control who she would marry. And this was some kind of an act of defiance or rebellion. or that the other one is that maybe she was so unhappy she just didn't want to see, so she metaphorically blinded herself to what was happening in her life and what was happening around her. So I think it's difficult to find a very simplistic answer to this. I don't agree that it was just some act of rebellion and spite, because it's very clear through the Mahabharata that the source of her power is her piety and devotion, including to her husband, and that she was someone who obtained boons from Shiva, from Veda Vyasa himself, and whose curse Sri Krishna accepted. So there must have been some virtue and nobility within her, otherwise that would not have been possible. At the same time, I think it's easy to imagine that she would not have been very happy in her circumstances to be married to someone like Dhritarashtra, who would not inherit the throne, and who's not a particularly strong or admirable character. And I think that actually makes her character stronger, that even when her husband may not have been ideal, she was still capable of so much devotion and loyalty towards him. And I think there's another question that the Mahabharata raises about this vow, or this blindfolding of herself, which is, would it have been better if she had not blindfolded herself, if she had been the eyes and ears for her husband and been in control of her full senses as queen and as the mother to the princes? And this, I think, the Mahabharata never answers, but it raises this question. And I think there's an interesting parallel here between her and Bhishma, because Bhishma is the other one who takes a very terrible vow. He takes this vow of celibacy, and this vow itself is so powerful that he can choose the moment of his death. He's revered and respected for this vow. His name, Bhishma, comes from taking this terrible vow. But the Mahabharata also plays with this, because it asks, was it right for him to make this vow? He was the prince. He did this to please his father, Shantanu, who wanted to marry Satyavati. But would it have been more appropriate for him not to take that vow, because his dharma as the prince of the kingdom, to ensure the succession of the line, should have come first? And there's actually a conversation, I believe, between Krishna and Arjuna, which deals with this. So I think it's an interesting parallel between both Bhishma and Gandhari in terms of these vows that they've taken, that they're revered for, but at what price? And I don't think, again, that there's a simple answer to this. I think the lesson may be that anytime you take a vow or make a sacrifice like this, you should think through all of the consequences and your responsibilities, not just for yourself, but towards the kingdom and for your family. So I think that's one interesting thing. Another is this relationship between Gandhari and Kunti. So again, in ways they're rivals for obvious reasons throughout the story. And then there's some interesting contrast between them. So Kunti, of course, has to abandon her firstborn son, Karna, and both Karna and Kunti suffer for this for the rest of their lives. On the other hand, Gandhari, when Duryodhan is born, Vidur and the other brahmanas in the court actually advised Dhritarashtra to forsake him, that he will bring so much wickedness to the kingdom that it is better to abandon him. But they're unable to do so. And throughout the Mahabharata, the tragedy of Gandhari is she's someone who in her own right was noble and virtuous, yet because she was so attached to her family, she's not able to let them go. So that's an interesting difference between Kunti and Gandhari. And then I think in some ways, Kunti, who also had a difficult job in raising the Pandavas, including two sons who were not her own biological sons, but she kept them united against all odds, including when they were all attracted to Draupadi. She made sure that Draupadi never became a source of divide among them, that all of them were married to her. She kept them on the side of dharma, and she protected their interests. She was successful in a way that Gandhari was not, because Gandhari clearly recognized what dharma was. She knew the futility of what Duryodhan wanted to do, but she was unable to stop them along the way. So I think there again that rivalry comes through in that contrast. And then finally, in their last encounters with Krishna, so So Gandhari's last encounter with Krishna is to curse him, which again she realizes it's also kind of tragic because it's futile. She utters this curse, she wastes all her tapobala, but this was always part of Krishna's plan, that the Vrishtis would also go away like this. He had come to lighten the burden of the earth, which meant the great heroes of the age had all had to depart. So obviously this curse was also in a way part of Krishna's plan. Otherwise, why would she say in 36 years specifically this will happen? So there again, she's exercising her power, but nothing really comes of it. On the other hand, when Krishna finally leaves Hastinapur, Kunti actually asks a boon of him, which is to visit sorrow upon sorrow on her again and again, because it's only through sorrow that she can remember Krishna. And it's a very beautiful prayer. So again, you see this contrast in their relationships with Krishna and what they ask for, what they curse him with in the end. But I think also, when I think of the two of them as I explore in the novel, I think there's a bond there too, because I think very few other people could have understood what each of them went through. So I think of them as kind of having the sisterhood. Again, Kunti goes with Gandhari and Dhritarashtra to the forest to look after them. So there is kind of this bond there, I think, which again, I explore. And then the last part of it is, so what do we make of Gandhari? And I think in a lot of the interpretations I've read, it's always a judgment. Either she was just a devoted, loyal wife who just could not rise above her circumstances, who was kind of a victim, or she is held accountable that she was not a good mother, perhaps because she blindfolded herself, or that she was too attached and could not do what Kunti did, so she's blamed as being this bad mother or bad queen, or she's kind of shown as being like this symbol of this rebellion and defiance against the society in which she was in. And for me, when I was writing this book, for me it was kind of a voyage of discovery myself, because in the beginning those were kind of the questions I was wrestling with. And then what I thought is, it's actually very unfair to judge or evaluate her or reduce her to this kind of assessment. But I think it's much more complicated than that. And I actually remember one afternoon I was sitting with my Diksha Guru, and I was telling him, this is the story I want to write, and this is how I'm thinking about Gandhari. And he said just one line, but that line really stayed with me. He said, Gandhari is very difficult to write about. What we can say about her is that even Sri Krishna respected her so much. And really that's what stayed with me, is this idea, if someone like Sri Krishna had this respect for Gandhari, then I think we also must have this respect for her without kind of this black and white type of judgment. So that was kind of the theme that drove the rest of my book. And I thought I would like to make this as interactive as possible and open it up to Q&A. So I just thought I'd read a short passage from the book, and I'll end with that. So this passage takes place once Gandhari knows that she is pregnant, and so that's where this begins. One day, Gandhari complained to Ayla, her maid, "It feels like I have 100 babies inside of me, all waiting to be born. That would really be a fine mess if I am to bear all 100 sons at once." Ayla clucked sympathetically. It was Gandhari's intent to imbue her baby with education even while he was in the womb. She wanted to recite all of the hymns to the devas that she had learned, to surround him with auspicious vibrations, to give him the company of the devas. She wanted to teach him all that Subala had taught her, reciting the names of all the eminent dynasties and lineages of the ruling families of Bharat. She wanted to tell him about the values by which to live, how to care for and win the favor of the people, the duties of a king. But in this too she was thwarted by Dhritarashtra. He would lie next to her in bed for hours, whispering bitterly into her belly, how he had been deprived of the throne by fate, how all of his hopes were vested in this baby boy, who would finally win for him the throne he was denied. Gandhari sometimes tried to put her hands on her belly to protect the baby from these venomous outpourings. as if she could cover his ears. Months and months passed. It had been a year now, over a year, and still no babies emerged from her womb. Gandhari grew weaker and weaker. She was on the verge of unconsciousness all the time, but lacked the respite of sleep. She was tormented by nightmares of hellish worlds full of fire and demons. In her visions, all she saw was a blazing fire spread across the entire horizon, scorching her skin as she walked through it, looking for her babies. Every time she opened her mouth to call out to them, she swallowed fire, and her organs withered and died. She became a walking skeleton, but still she went after her babies. They began to cry out to her like hatchlings. She heard their cries faint through the din of the roaring fire that howled as it ate more and more of the world, consuming and charring everything in sight. She never saw them, only heard their cries, crawling and groping through this world of fire. It was as if she had been left to die. Gandhari stopped counting the days once her pregnancy exceeded a year, and so she did not know when it was that Dhritarashtra came running to her chamber. It had been months since he had visited her, and Gandhari stirred in surprise, trying to wake herself into a lucid state. She tried to comb her hair with her fingers to appear presentable, but she had grown so weak that she was unable to do so. Dhritarashtra was ranting incoherently, trying to push his way in. Her heart began to pound in terror. Had she miscarried without realizing it? Her hands groped towards her belly. No, that pulsing mass was still there, throbbing inside her belly. He pushed in and leaned over Gandhari, snarling, you promised me 100 sons." She began to quake. "That is what Shiva has promised me. That is what Veda Vyasa promised me. Surely it will come true." It hurt her to talk, so parched was her throat. So long had it been since someone had spoken to her, since she had managed to drink a few drops of water. Even though he was yelling at her so bitterly, it was almost a relief to have a human interaction, to feel like someone cared enough to visit. "It is no use now. 1 son or 100. You are too late, woman. You have been in this room for over a year now, over 1 year and still no baby." "I'm trying my best." He sputtered indignantly. "Well, you need not bother anymore. Kunti has given birth to a boy. Pandu has an heir." She tried to lift her head, shock freezing the blood in her veins. "Kunti, Pandu, how? And Pandu is still alive? How is it possible? The curse, it cannot be possible." "How do I know?" But the messenger was a rishi, so no doubt could be cast on the truth of the matter. A hale, healthy son, as fair and noble as Yama, the god of death and righteousness himself. That is what they say. And with that he left. For long minutes Gandhari was shell-shocked. She could not believe it. What had she come to? How low had she fallen? For months and months she had held that massive life within her, protecting it with all her strength and will, gritting her teeth through the worst kinds of pain, defying the concerns of doctors in order to keep that fetus safe. She had taken Bhishma's command to keep safe the future of the Kudu clan within her belly very seriously. She had nursed it with her blood, her marrow, her very flesh. She had taken in faith the words of Shiva and Veda Vyasa that she would be mother to 100 sons. "Fool, I have been fooled by the devas, by the rishis, by this family. I have lost to Kunti again. No more of this." A low, animal-like primal scream started emitting from her belly, then her lungs, her chest, her dry throat, her mouth finally emerging from her trembling lips. She screamed and began striking her belly, hard, again and again, with force she did not know she had left inside her. She bashed her belly until her bangles shattered and stuck in shards into the skin of her taut stomach, drawing blood. She struck her belly harder and harder, desperate to expel that mass of flesh from her body, that cancerous thing that had devoured and destroyed her. Still she did not desist. Finally, as Isla ran back to her, hearing her screams, there was an immense heaving from within the deepest recesses of her, and that mass of flesh dislodged itself from the lining of her womb, and lunged downwards like an iceberg ripping off from a glacier wall. As Isla cried out in shock and worry, reaching out to try to save her, that thing came out of her in a burst of blood and strange fluids, a heavy mass of dead, dense flesh, as heavy and hard as bone, woven round and round into a tight ball of flesh that smelled rotten and diseased. Gandhari cried out in anguish, feeling simultaneous relief and grief, so overcome and overwrought that she slipped into a deep unconsciousness, into sleep for the first time in many months.
Thanks, Aditi. Aditi, for recreating the story of the Mahabharata here and giving us a new perspective about Gandhari.